Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is Listening Beyond the Soundbites. Ben Kinsley is with me, who's a co-producer and co-host. Ben, how are you?
Good, thank you, Pat.
And your company is called?
Imperium Advisors.
Thank you very much. We'd like to give a little plug where it's due. And our very special guest today probably deserves, shouldn't have any introduction because everybody knows him. It's our Lieutenant Governor, David Zuckerman. How are you? Governor, that's the official thing,
well,
right?
the governor's not around, apparently. I learned that when I was Lieutenant Governor-elect at my first Lieutenant Governor's meeting about 3 or 4 weeks after I got elected in 2016. And people in the halls kept calling me governor. I said, I'm not the governor, I'm Lieutenant Governor. And they said, well, when the governor's not in proximity, they call you governor. And I guess it goes back to military stuff, just like a
Lieutenant Colonel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that was news to me. You learn on the job.
I got yelled at one time. It was Doobie was walking down the stairs, and I walked up, and I was walking up those god-awful, those windy ones. And I said to him, "Oh, Governor, how are you?" Well, this lady behind me, you don't know. She's yelling at me. You don't know anything. That's not the governor. That's the lieutenant. And Doobie stopped and said, "No, ma'am. Actually, she's right. That is my title." And
well, these things happen.
Yes.
Well, since his business got a plug, can I say what my business is?
Absolutely.
Yes,
I'm
please.
just joking.
No.
Full Moon Farm.
Full Moon Farm.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Just
well,
fun.
the other thing too we should talk about, because we kind of mentioned when you were considering running for lieutenant governor, you actually kind of had I don't know if it would be a pre-interview, I guess, with then Lieutenant Governor Scott, trying to figure out like what the role is, right? Like you invited him down to your farm and you kind of did that
it
whole
wasn't
thing.
like a TV interview, but my wife and daughter were also curious. I was a little bit curious. A lot of people, on paper what a lieutenant governor does. You can look it up in the Constitution, but it's curious. What is it really like?
Right.
What is the time commitment? What are the obligations? What can you do for the state? What are the opportunities in the job? And that was great. Vermont, we were talking before the show about how we just have a different way about us here, where people of different political persuasions can still have very friendly, casual conversations, help each other out, throw ideas off each other. And he was very pleasant, made the trip out to the farm when he was up near the area, and
that's nice.
We had a picnic table chat for a good little bit.
That's so cool.
It's pretty cool.
It would have been great to be videotaped. That's nice.
I remember that, because it was in the news,
It did,
and I thought that was one of the most interesting things that, because you don't hear that in other places. You have
I think it's great you just asked.
Right.
I think a lot of people just run for the job, and they don't necessarily have a clue on what it's about.
Well,
exactly.
My daughter asked, and I said, you know what, we could probably invite him out, and we'll see. And he came, and very gracious.
Yeah, he is. He is good guy. Well, now that we've completely not followed our agenda, I'm going to turn it. I'm actually going to start out with something I read in the paper today. You become my hero today. I said, all right, Gov. At the stroll of the heifers in Bennington. Brattleboro. Oh, sorry.
I did that same thing.
Don't run statewide. That whole county's against you now. I just forgot that.
Opposite sides of the state.
It's like a hallmark for them.
I do the same with St. Johnsbury and St. Albans. I mix them up all the time.
Yeah, they're different places for sure.
Yeah, definitely different places.
So you made the paper because you had a group of people protesting.
Well, I didn't have them protest. They protested.
Okay. They were protesting, and they were sort of messing up the works.
Well, they interrupted the parade for sure. Yeah.
And what did you do?
Well, they right where the announcing booth was and the judging booth, and where we were announcing it over the radio and public television, Tim Johnson and I, they cut into the parade and did a die-in, I guess is what it would be called, and they had a banner calling attention to climate change, and I think maybe 15 of them sort of acted like they were passing out or dying on the street, and 2 people were calling out about, what are we going to do about climate change in our future? And it blocked the parade route. So, it was interesting. They were organized in that they had some folks walking up and down the parade route with petitions asking residents of Brattleboro to petition the select board to do more about climate change. So they were trying to draw attention to that. But it was an interesting conundrum as an announcer to both try to encourage them to do what they were going to do, but not interrupt it for too long.
Right.
And to say, citizen engagement is a good thing. In Vermont, we greatly pride ourselves in that through town meeting, through petitions, through lots of things.
Right.
But that also, whether you're to the right or the left, if you interrupt what's happening, You usually have a good 5 or 10 minutes to make your point, and then you start to overstay your welcome.
Right.
And wear out that support. And so I started speaking to that a little bit and saying to them, you know, you've made a great point. A lot of people here, certainly in that county, Windham County,
Right.
of course, are very interested in this issue and think more could be done. And so they had a supportive crowd for a while. But a few people also said, you know, we're here for this parade.
That's right.
We've come for this other thing. And so I said, you know, let's acknowledge what they've done, give them a round of applause for making a good point, drawing attention out to this issue, which is very related to agriculture.
Sure, right.
I can tell you this May was tough on
Yeah.
our farm, and I know the dairy farms have really struggled getting their corn in, getting their hay in. And but at the same time, let's give them a big round of applause to acknowledge that we care, but also to say, okay, thank
thanks.
you, now let's move on.
Right.
Yeah.
And most of them got up at that, and 2 stayed down, and the local first responders and law enforcement came in and put them on backboards and shuttled one off, then the other, and that added about 5 more minutes, a couple minutes apiece. But it seemed to be a reasonable balance. We got the parade back underway,
Yeah,
and
that's great.
point was made.
Well, and you got a few applause yourself for trying to pitch in. They
Little
said,
bit.
They said. Well, that's
Trying.
great. I think it's good because we've had a conversation about that on the show. When it's in your face and they're really stopping you from doing something like
Right.
what they've done at the State House.
Sure, at
I
times.
mean, you just can't. You get people mad.
Right.
And whatever your cause is, the person's going, no, I don't think so.
Yeah, there's a strategic line there,
Yeah.
but at the same time, you know, folks get really to the edge. Whether it's, you know, there were a lot of folks really angry at the governor signing gun bills a couple of years ago, and that got interrupted quite a bit by shouting and
Right,
yelling
right.
from another perspective.
Right.
Right.
But then, you know, in this event, they stopped it, or at the State House, you know. But you can interrupt and make a point, and you can interrupt and over-make a point, and there's a
Well, I
fine
thought
balance
that
there,
was
and
a
it's different every
great
time.
way to try to get them to see what they're doing.
Yeah, it's true. It is. It's a fine line, and it depends on the venue. It depends on the event. It depends on,
Yeah.
you know, what's going on. And
Well, if you got a
Yeah,
whole
there's no
street
hard and
full of
fast
heifers,
rule.
right.
Right, right.
I mean, they can only stay calm
Yeah,
and quiet
exactly.
for so long. They
There's
gotta
only-
keep moving.
yeah.
Luckily, it moving, as you say, but it turns out all the heifers had gone by.
Oh,
I thought there was still some more to come because I hadn't fully looked through the parade
Yeah.
list, and I pointed out that, you know, cows being on pavements not great.
Right.
Cars
Hot.
and vehicles that were idling, waiting, that were pulling, you know, floats and so
Right.
forth. So if they care about climate change and they care about the animals, make your point, but also don't keep those things
Right.
going and waiting. So,
Right.
so I think a balance was struck.
you did a good thing.
Very cool.
All right, back to the questions.
All right.
Seriously.
Back,
Yeah,
Trey,
really.
back on
Back to
track.
What are we talking about?
All the fun stuff. Gotta get
Yeah,
the fun
really.
stuff out of the way
I've got a couple
first.
other things I could ask you, but we'll
All right.
we'll do it later.
Wherever you want to go, it's fine with me.
Let's just do it. You've got a strong service history in Vermont. I'm going to read this because I'll
Okay.
never remember it.
Fair enough.
You served in the Vermont House of Representatives for 7 years, seven terms,
Yep.
and the Vermont Senate for 2 terms. In
Right.
2016, you ran for LG as a progressive and received the Democratic nomination.
Right. I ran in
That
their
was a-
primary, so I ran
yes.
as both in the general.
And Chap Smith and Keisha Rom ran in a primary with
Yeah.
you, and you came out
I-
as the leader there. And then you were reelected in 2018 when you were running, when Don Turner was running.
Yeah.
And so I think I just wanted to ask, you've done the House, the Senate, and those are different how you campaign.
Yep.
And obviously a statewide race is like different than
Completely
all of them
different. Oh, yeah.
together.
Yeah.
So how do you approach doing campaigns? I mean, you've really got to understand how.
Yeah. Well, in the House, as you know as well, it's really door to door. And
Right.
go to local events that are happening, go to things that are already happening. What I've learned is it's a lot more work to organize an event for a campaign than it is to go to events that are already being organized by somebody else.
Oh yeah. Yep.
And as long as you're not sort of interloping and taking over their event,
Right.
but you're there mingling and chatting with folks often most events have a casual time. You know, just getting to know people, listening to people, having them get to know you. And I think one of the advantages I had in running statewide was as a legislator for, 18 of those years
Right.
prior to running statewide, I have always been an organizer outside the building. I was never someone who inside the building was in close with the leadership team and just said,
Right.
look, can we just do this? And they would say yes, and then like wave wands and make it happen,
Right.
which isn't exactly how it goes. But sometimes if the top says
Right.
let's go, they get the rest of the folks on board. I always organized from the outside. which meant I went to communities all over the state to organize, in particular marriage equality, GMO labeling, for 15, 20 years. And so when it came to a statewide race, folks in Brattleboro, even though I was a representative from Burlington, I had people in Brattleboro that I'd worked with for 20 years.
Wow.
I had people in Middlebury. I
That's
had
the key.
people in the Northeast Kingdom that I'd met with. And so in Vermont, that first race, when Phil Scott also won the governor's office, people said, how did Vermont elect Phil
Yeah,
Scott
we
governor
do that often,
and
don't
David
we?
Zuckerman
Yeah.
lieutenant governor? And I said, yes, we have some different views on a number of issues, although I think we both have a reputation of listening and meeting and being respectful to people. But Vermonters want a familiarity with you. And ultimately, when you go all over the state for 20 years, it's not that big a state. People start to get to know who you are. And I think that helped with that statewide race, whereas my two opponents in the primary as representatives, obviously I think Shapp had gotten around the state more as speaker, but still mostly in political circles and organizing political circles, which is fair enough. It's a lot of work to do it, but not organizing around issues for a really long time as I had. And I think that was probably a big piece of the difference.
That's great.
And that's one of the, in a lot of ways, the primaries are almost more difficult than a general election, I think, because you have to distinguish yourself from candidates who may have very similar positions to you.
Well, look at the National Democratic Primary.
Right.
Oh
And
my
that'll
God,
be a great
it's
example
hysterical
of, you know,
listening to them.
and I think that was probably true in 2016 also. Is like you had that many candidates running in a race and they're all trying to distinguish themselves. And of course, the candidate that was the most distinguishable from the rest of the field was the one that pulled ahead. It'll be interesting to see how 2020 goes, you know, and which one will end up rising to the top. But I think, you know, it's almost more interesting in a lot of ways looking at primaries, I think, because you see how candidates try to distinguish themselves.
And historically, people have an easier time sort of battling with someone with different views than with similar views, because you want to be respectful and you want to show little nuanced differences, which sometimes can be tricky because you want to say, well, you didn't go as far as on an issue as I did, or you went too far on an issue than I did, depending on what it is and who's speaking, and you want to say that in a way that makes it clear without knocking them too hard, because that person has a lot of friends. If you're trying to get some people to come over from their constituency
And after
or
the
supporters.
primary, they're still Democrats,
And,
right?
and you want to pull those votes back
sure.
out for the general.
Yeah.
So it is a different can of
That's like
worms.
what Shumlin did. He brought the people that he ran with in the primary, he brought them
Right into his cabinet.
So
That's right.
there you go.
That's
Which
right.
is a good strategy.
As lieutenant governor, you don't get a cabinet. You get
That's
one
true. One person.
One person. I
I
know.
joked the other day, the whole reason I left the legislature to run for lieutenant governor so I'd have one staff person.
There you
Because in the
go.
legislature, you have zero.
That's
Zero.
True. That's
Yeah.
true. That's another whole
Which is-
individually.
If we have time, we should talk about that
Sure.
at some point later in the show. If we have time, that's just how the legislature in Vermont's structured, and you know
Yeah.
what.
We don't have a lot of stuff other states do.
Yeah.
Right,
yeah.
right.
Offices and
For
people.
better or worse in some cases.
That's
you know.
right. That's right. So yeah, there is how I got here.
Yes, right. What? How you got here?
Well, sort of through the different
Oh, yes, right,
races and
And
ultimately.
before all that, I didn't. You started in 1997. Was the first. What were you doing
Well, I
before
ran.
that?
Well, I did actually run in '94, and I lost by 59 votes. And then I ran in '96 and
And you
won.
went-
So
oh, okay.
'97
where were
was
you,
the first time I
Where
was
were
there.
you at that time? School?
I was
or-
in Burlington. I had been a student at UVM, and in 1992, I was a cynical student about politics, and I was an activist and an organizer. Those terrible things. And I thought elected office is a load of hooey. Corporate money runs everything. Those big donations are what politicians kowtow to. And then we had Congressman Bernie Sanders. And I was like, who's that guy? He's not part of the two parties. He doesn't take corporate money, and he wears his views straight on the sleeve.
And
Agree
he
or
never
disagree.
changes them as
he
much
doesn't.
as.
Yeah, and he doesn't put his finger to the wind of the moment.
Right.
And I was like, wow, you can be someone who has strong convictions and say them and somehow win? That's remarkable.
Right.
So I volunteered for him, and I think we registered almost 1,000
Wow.
people to vote at UVM that year. And so he and his team and local folks involved were like, who's this guy who's working so hard to
New
register
guy.
1,000 people to vote? It's not like Obama was on the ballot, or this year coming up Trump, which a lot of young people are sort of wanting to register. You have to convince them to. And through that, I met local folks and helped with some local campaigns. They asked me to run in '94, and I lost. And I started getting more and more involved from then on.
I told that to the senator. I said, as much as we disagree, I really do admire the fact that he hasn't changed his views.
No,
They
never.
maybe a little tweak here and there just from
Sure.
experience, and he's learned some
And you
new
make some
information.
nuances.
Yeah,
and-
yeah. I mean, because that's actually be sort of bad if you never changed and never listened.
Yeah, you have to
But
learn.
he does it just right. I mean, I don't agree with him, but he does, and he's passionate about it, and always.
Well, and every time someone against him pulls out some video from 1974,
Right.
as if it's going to take him down, it
Yeah.
boosts him
Yeah,
up.
right.
So they're like, wow,
Exactly.
he's the most considered. Because right now,
Because
a
he's
lot
just
of
said the
people
same
all the
thing.
same.
who are
Yeah.
cynical about politics, as I was in '92, go, oh, that person, is saying these things now, but what were they saying 5 years
That's
ago?
right, same
Are they
thing.
saying it because that's where the
Or
wave
what,
is
or
moving?
what were they saying last week?
That's
you know,
right,
Which
that's
is
right.
You
like,
gotta give him credit.
I
for
mean,
that.
in today's day and age, you can't. That's one of the good things about technology is you can't get away with some of that stuff
Right.
that you might have been able to get away with 20 years ago. But now everyone's got a cell phone.
Gotcha.
That's right.
Everyone's recording you. So
But
you
as
can't
you point out,
you know,
once in a while people take a snippet as a soundbite to try
Yeah.
to
And take it-
submarine
yeah,
you
right, yeah, right.
when it's not in the context of
That's
the
right.
broader discussion. So if
Right.
you want to talk well-rounded about something, people will go, "Oh, I just got 7 words that's make that person
Exactly,
into a
right.
awful, terrible
Right.
being." and
Right.
Put
Love
that up.
Welcome to politics.
welcome to politics.
Yeah.
Keeps evolving. So how do you view the lieutenant governor's job, and what have you brought to it to kind of make it your own?
Yeah, well, interestingly, because as we said earlier, there's the defined role. You preside over the Senate. You're basically the town moderator of the
Right.
Senate. So you run the meeting, got to know the rules, know the procedures. You serve on something called the Committee on Committees. So those of you that love bureaucratic
group.
names.
Yes.
Yep.
In the House, the Speaker gets to decide most all of the assignments of representatives to their committees, citizen appointments to state committees of various sorts. And in the Senate, it's a 3-person body. It's the lieutenant governor, it's the leader of the Senate elected by the Senate, the president pro tem, and then it's for titles of positions, this is the funniest one in all of government, the 3rd member of the Committee on Committees.
That's Dick's title.
And that's Dick Maasey. Yeah.
Which
And
is
so
always this usually anyway the senior ranking member.
it's often,
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it has been for a very long time. So the 3 of us meet and make those same assignments. And then the 3rd role, officially, is of course if something happens to the
Right.
governor, I would become the governor.
Right.
I'm the first in line to succeed the governor if the governor can't
Oh, and when
perform
he's
his
out
or her
of town,
duties.
you're
When he's out of state, certainly I'm sort of governor on duty.
yeah, right.
But basically, with communication today, unlike 200 years ago,
Yeah.
if something needs to be decided, the governor could decide it. I've had to sign 2 documents while he was out of state, but otherwise, it's really you're sort of on call
Yeah.
if
Right.
there's an emergency. of
Because
sorts.
I know I shouldn't give away secrets, but I think it was with Brian Doobie that he was governor, and he just thought, oh, I'm governor, and there was a little brouhaha about decisions that he thought he could make. And when you read the language, you actually can make it. It's just that,
You're
as
the
Ben
acting
said-
governor, but I don't think it plays out
No.
very well in the long run.
Yeah,
Well,
it
that's-
probably doesn't.
No, so that was
You
quite
get a little
the,
over your skis a little bit.
Yeah.
But so the interesting thing is, I mean, it's paid reasonably well. I mean, it's a part-time position.
Right.
It's paid very well. For Vermont standards, it's paid well.
yeah.
It's about $70,000 a year, and with benefits. And so I've tried to sort of take it and say, okay, well, it's paid full-time.
Yeah.
And even though those positions don't take full-time, I've tried to work as much full-time as I can.
Right.
I also have a farm, so in the summer it gets squeezed a little bit. But get around the state and be a little bit of an ambassador of the State House out around the state. So while things are happening in the State House, sometimes I will go have town meetings around the
Right.
state, talk about what's going on, answer questions. Not always about what my position on an issue is, but here's what I'm hearing is going on in the
Right.
issue. Here's the
That's
various
great.
sides. Be a little bit of an ambassador for the State House, and ultimately, because I got elected the same night as this president, I've turned a little bit into being an ambassador for democracy because this president has really sort of tipped democracy on its head in terms of the traditional norms that we've experienced, particularly as New England and Vermont.
Right.
Sort of the hallmark of where democracy came from. That this shift in sort of how someone is president and maintaining a presidency as someone who seems to feel like if I represent my base, that's all I'm supposed to do, versus you run trying to get a certain population out to vote. But once you're elected, you're supposed to serve
It's
everybody.
right?
And so I try to sort of bring some of that back because people are really scared and they're really feeling a bit on edge. I mean, Vermont is the least Trump supportive state in the country.
Right.
And then also, I do have other events where I'm trying to advocate for issues and hold town meetings about them. I did a series with Rights and Democracy about an economy for all. I have a movie series that is 4 months of the year at the State House. It's one night a month,
Right.
and then the other 7-8 months we're out around the state doing one. I have one coming up in Middlebury on veterans issues.
Oh, nice.
And so it's a range of issues all over the state, different movie each month. And then usually I have a panel with some experts on that topic. And we
great.
just talk about whatever the topic is. And we have 20 to as many as 70, 80 people show up for those to just.
It's pretty cool.
Wow, that's a great turnout.
Are those like documentary type?
They're usually
films, or-
documentaries. A lot of them on minimum wage, or we've had them on issues around violence in our society. We've had them on racial injustice issues. One of them was a movie called 13th, which is about the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, really going through the history of slavery and then the 13th Amendment and sort of what led to that. I had a movie on women organizing in England back in 1968
All right.
when they were earning about 50 cents on the dollar in the auto manufacturing plants. And they eventually met with Prime Minister Thatcher and got it up to, I think it was 80 or 85 cents, which was a big jump in one leap.
Really? That's great.
They did a tremendous job. But some of the struggles with their own spouses and walking out on the picket line and,
Right.
the workforce in the auto industry was 90% men, and they were shutting down the whole plant because they were sewing the seats. And if the seats didn't get sewed, the cars couldn't be built, and everybody was
Ah.
out. So it just showed a lot of the tension of labor struggles. We've shown movies about Native American issues. This one coming up is on veterans issues. So it's a wide range, and we get sponsors from different groups around the state to help boost awareness and turnout on them. So
Good job.
a
I
lot
think
of
that's
things.
great.
What I think is cool, up until Howard Dean, really, the lieutenant governors were really just did the statutory things. They
Right.
presided over the Senate, covered for the governor when they were, out of state. Kind of all the stuff that you mentioned. That's part of the statutory,
Obligation.
role,
Yeah.
obligations of a lieutenant governor, and that's kind of what they did until Howard Dean, and then he was kind of like, I want this to be more.
He focused on children, I think. Was
Yeah.
Yeah, right,
his
for
hallmark.
sure.
His hallmark, and
Yeah.
he's like, I want to do more with this role than just go through the motions.
Right.
And I think pretty much every lieutenant governor since then has had
A little higher profile.
a little higher, more going to more events, host their own events. Several of them have had, I guess, for lack of a better term, pet projects. Like children's. Are there any issues for you that you feel like really passionate about that you want to use your position to
we
move
did a number
forward?
of things. Early on, we talked about a youth initiative, and that was a lot about just democracy. I learned a lot about democracy in school, and I found, unfortunately, certainly at the college level, the number of people who are turned on or turned off is not really in a very good ratio at that age. And in U.S. history, I think it's really taught sort of textbook and not substance of really what happens in negotiations, what happens in a conference committee, what happens in a committee
Right.
room with testimony and information. And so I've done a lot with folks who are too young to vote still, and said, your legislator represents an area that includes you as part of the census count. So you may not have a chance to vote yet, but you have every right
Speak up.
to include your opinion in that legislator's thinking. And I said, one of the tools that now exists that didn't a number of years ago is email. And I said, as a young person, if you use email as a tool of communication, your legislator doesn't know how old you are.
Aha.
So if you take some time to make sure you word it right and you don't
Right.
reveal your age some with your language skills, you can point out your issue. And then as you get older, sometimes I'm talking to 16, 15, 17-year-olds, and I say, depending how your legislator responds to you, if they don't treat you with respect, you're not far away from being able to vote, and they're just as likely to be on the ballot again.
Right.
And you can communicate with them about that and say, don't dismiss
Never
me
win,
as a
that's
young
right.
person. I'm going to be a voter in 1 or 3 more years, and I care about more jobs,
Right.
less regulation, minimum wage, whatever it is,
Right.
climate change.
Climate change, yeah.
And they have a different way of looking at things too, which might help explain issues and to us older folks, things we don't look at things the way they do.
We have a
That's cool.
different set of experiences
Yeah,
through
right,
our lives.
right.
Yeah.
So that was a big one because I've come into it as a farmer and recognizing that one of the biggest challenges our state faces as we talk about our declining population. Although the last 2 years we've actually grown in population, just
Right.
for the measure. But rural areas, whether it's Vermont, whether it's Nebraska, it doesn't matter whether it's Mississippi, no matter how red or blue it is, rural areas are losing populations in this country. And sometimes we get caught up in the rhetoric of Vermont's losing a population, it must be because of our policies. And the reality is rural areas, upstate New Hampshire, depending on regions and population density is actually a much bigger factor. And what we don't have is we don't have the big city that Nebraska
Right,
has.
right.
Even New Hampshire doesn't necessarily have a big city, but it's got bigger cities than Burlington, and it's also got Boston not that far
And
away.
people are choosing to leave the rural life for the city? What do you
Particularly
think?
younger people.
Oh,
So if you
okay.
think about it, there's just more excitement. There's
Yeah.
there's more things to do.
Right.
There's more things to explore. What you then see is sometimes people returning later,
Right.
mid-late 30s, early
Right.
40s,
To have their
raise their
families, yeah,
families.
right,
And
right.
so, but my thought has been a lot about, okay, what do we do for our rural economy? We're not going to land a 500 or 1,000 person auto manufacturing
Right,
plant.
Right.
We just don't have, even if we want to do it through tax
Yeah,
incentives,
no more IBMs.
we
right?
don't have the money to do that. I mean,
Right.
New York gives away more money in tax incentives than our whole budget.
Right.
So what are you going to do? So focusing on our rural economy and ideas for our rural economy has been a big piece of it because we're in trouble if we don't do something different. And we're in this great position because we are so close to Boston, New York, the whole megalopolis of the Northeast area, that actually if we really did invest in broadband, I know a million politicians have said that,
Right.
but if we did that, there are young people who are in their 30s and 40s who can make good money at their
Yeah.
computer with a small business and have clients in Boston or New
Mhm.
York and go down and visit with them for 3
Sure.
days
Right.
every third or fourth week, 3 days, 2 nights, visit with 6 or 10 clients, and then come back to Vermont
Right.
if they had high-speed internet and could do that work. And same with our farming. I think there's some really great innovative things going on. So our rural economy and young sort of youth engagement and empowerment. And then just in general, we've talked about the affordability of Vermont. I think the governor's done a great job really
Yeah,
highlighting with
right,
that word.
right.
I think he's very accurate in using that word. I want to give kudos to the governor. But I think back to going a little deeper than the soundbite, what is the affordability problem and what's causing it?
Right.
And if you actually look at cost of living in Vermont, we're only a couple percent higher than the average in the country. And most of the northern tier is because winter is expensive.
Right.
Right.
It beats up our cars. That makes it more expensive. Heating. However, where we're really coming up short is we're about 2% over the national average on our cost of living. We're about 18% behind the country on average income.
Right.
Ah, well,
And so to me, we can and should always look for efficiencies in government, but also how do we get working people some more money in their pocket,
Right.
because that's going to close the affordability gap
that's
in a
interesting.
way that
It's even worse too if you look at household income. Like actually, if you look at family income aside from median wages per worker.
Yeah.
So like the median wages per worker is about that 18, but if you look at family level income, is almost 20, is over 20%
Below the
below
national
national average.
Right.
So like families themselves, like the family units,
That's right.
are making significantly below
Yeah.
national average.
So if the costs are the same, but you're making less money, your belt is tight.
Right.
And
For
you're
sure.
squeezed. So that energy is very real, and the governor's done a good job of tapping into that and addressing it and pointing out that I might disagree with him a little bit on what the solution is, because again, to me, it's the wage side.
Not the.
We should always be looking for efficiencies. I took an idea to the governor 6 months into all of our first terms and said, I get it. He chose not to have me in his cabinet. He chose sort of to hold me at arm's
Right.
length. Fair enough. I was disappointed because I thought we could do
Right.
something together. So I went to the governor in June of that year and I said, there are some real opportunities here with the energy the president is bringing to this country, whereas a Republican governor is a progressive Democrat lieutenant governor. If we showed the country that people could work together,
Right.
what a
breath
of fresh air that would be. And one of those ideas was to say, let's dig right down to the front lines on human services and education.
Right.
Right? Human services, $2.4
That's right.
billion
The
budget.
two biggest.
Education,
drain.
$1.7 billion budget. The biggest increase in education is actually social services in our schools.
Right.
That's this
Yeah.
cost driver that's going through the roof. There must be an overlap in the work that's being done with some of these families and some of these kids. If we look at the front lines, talk to the experts who are day to day working with these families and say, can we find the overlap, save some money by reducing redundancy, maybe have a a satellite human service office in every school, so that those families have access to services and those kids get used to the school instead of, I think there's 12 or 14 around the state.
Yep.
Well, if you're a single car household with 2 working parents and one's on the first shift and one's on the second shift, where's the car to get you to those services?
Right.
But if it's at your local school instead of 30 miles away, maybe your neighbor would let you borrow the car. Let's find those efficiencies, create a better continuum of service. And in some school districts, they're doing this already. And I said, let's work together. It's a deep dive. It's going to take time. It's not a sexy thing.
Right.
But if we really want to address
Very
the
important.
costs,
Good for
let's
you.
do that.
Right.
Never got a call back from the governor to really explore it, which was unfortunate. And he said he took it to his staff, and they said, yeah, there's nothing there to be done or something.
Oh,
and I
that's
said,
wrong.
I said,
That's wrong.
I said, Governor, it's your call, not your staff's call.
Yeah.
And we've he's never called me back on it. So there's a limit to what I can do. I have one staff person. He's got
Right.
all of state government.
Right.
But I do think we can find efficiencies. We shouldn't just write it off that, we're only 2% more expensive,
Right.
therefore it's not a problem. No, of course it's something to address. But I think wages and raising people's incomes is a bigger issue on that affordability.
And my
gap.
take is social services costs should not be part of property tax.
Well, that's another piece
If
of
you
it.
look
It
at the
should be-
definition of property tax, it doesn't include social services, which should be paid out of the human services.
Which is general fund. It's
Right.
a little more progressive income source for the state. But
Right.
absolutely.
Yeah, and
agree.
because I know it's maybe moving Peter to pay Paul, but when all the money is in human services and we realize how much money we spend, they'll find efficiencies pretty quick, because
Yeah.
it'll be a staggering number, staggering.
I think there's possibility there. I don't absolutely know, but
Yes,
that's
there is,
a
you're
big
right.
issue.
You would think there would be. I mean, it's the other thing too that makes a lot of sense about bringing education and human services together, particularly for DCF, child services, is that schools have so much access to kids. I mean, they have more access than anyone aside from the parents in most cases.
Pretty much.
And it's a place where they can find problems early, right? So if a kid is struggling with something, chances are a teacher's going to notice, or a teacher's assistant's going to notice. And why not make that the touch point?
Well, and another piece people are maybe unaware of, but a lot of your wiring is done from 0 to 5, about 90% of it. So even by the time you get to school, yes, teachers identify it, but the ability to bend the curve has
Right.
already been greatly impacted. So, human services dealing with these families from 0 to 5. We've got great, parent-child centers. We've got a lot of early childhood stuff that we're working on in the state. But boy, that investment is a key one. And the governor highlighted that in his budget. The legislature also reinforced that, made a couple changes to where the funding was going, or where, baseline funding. But as a whole, we made that investment this year, and I think that was really
That's great.
important.
That's
Yeah,
great. That's-
absolutely.
I'm on the board of Prevent Child Abuse Vermont.
Great.
And the stories.
Yeah.
It's just incredible.
And those are lifelong impacts when,
Yeah,
when
right.
you have that kind of situation.
Yeah, I'm going to recommend that folks that are listening go to the Lieutenant Governor's website. It's excellent.
Oh,
I
thank
have
you.
to tell you, just great stuff, and there's a whole list of what his major initiatives and priorities are for this year. You've talked about 2 of them, I think. A youth initiative or rural economy, but you've got boosting wages, improving working conditions, ending gender stereotype and inequality. I'd like to talk about that. Protecting our environment, and we always talk about here the clean up the water. That's
Cleaning up
just-
the lake, yeah.
That is
course.
just one of our little things we
Well,
talk
you want
about
to
all
talk
the
about an
time.
economic engine for the state.
And
We
Yeah.
are shooting
Thank you for
ourselves in
that.
the foot.
Yeah, people say, well, that's in Burlington. I went, no,
No.
that hits your economy all over this state.
Well, and up into Franklin County,
right.
it's huge, up through the islands
Right.
and downways. And then ultimately, we have a lot of different smaller bodies of water that are starting to have
Right.
some of these
Yeah,
problems
Lake
too.
Carmi and
Absolutely.
Yeah. The other thing too, I think there's been a lot of talk this year about the pension fund obligations and some of the liabilities that the state has there.
Absolutely.
I think that we need to look at Lake Champlain or all of our waterways as part of that liability as well, because we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars that have not been put towards the lake in the last decade or so. And that we're going to have to put towards it in the next, 2 decades.
It's sort of like deferred maintenance.
Right.
We deferred maintenance on our pensions funds. We deferred maintenance on our lakes.
here
We
we are.
deferred maintenance on our schools. One of the aspects of that, again, going deeper than the soundbite, is, yeah, we can not raise taxes, or we can hold the line for now. But what does that do to the cost down
Right.
the road?
Right,
Down the
exactly.
road.
Whether it's under Howard Dean and then each governor after, it was every single one of all parties that
Right.
were slowly shorting the retirement funds, right? You make promises now that are going to be paid for later. Well, later comes.
Yes.
Later is coming
think
on
later's
climate
here.
change. Later is
Yeah.
here on water.
Yeah.
Later is here on these pensions, and that's really the struggle of our future. Is sort of chickens are coming home to roost,
Right.
and that's going to be a big challenge over these next number of years.
Because isn't there a risk that the feds will come in at some point if we don't fix it?
On water-
They're going to come in
Yeah.
and say, okay, folks, we're here.
And their
This is-
solution
We're
is
going
gonna
to
be
make
more
you pay
expensive.
for
Yeah.
this,
Exactly,
and
exactly.
that's the issue
You've
on
got to
water.
avoid that.
The issue on the pension funds is that our credit rating
Credit
changes,
down,
and so
yep.
then the cost of borrowing money
Yeah.
goes up.
Right.
So all of these costs are going to go up unless we find innovative, creative ways. And there's some really great ideas out there. You've got regenerative agriculture, where people are talking about not only just cover crops, and a lot more farmers are using cover crops, which is really good. That
Yeah.
reduces your soil erosion and runoff in the spring. It also sequesters carbon, basically sucks carbon out of the air, because plants breathe carbon dioxide.
Right,
We
right.
breathe oxygen, sort of we're the opposite of these plants. And they give off oxygen. So if you have cover crops on your fields that don't leave bare soil as much, you're pulling carbon dioxide out of the air. You're actually putting organic matter, carbon-based matter, into the soil, which makes it hold water better. And if it holds water better, you
Right.
also then get less
Right.
runoff, which is carrying those. So there's a lot that can be done in agriculture to actually turn the tide back. But again, it takes some investment. It takes Vermonters buying Vermont products in agriculture, which sometimes do cost a little more. So as an advocate of raising the minimum wage, I also want to say to the Vermonters who are living on the edge and would benefit
Right.
from that, make sure you then spend that money locally.
Here, right.
Don't go to Amazon. Don't travel out of state to nearby places to buy
Right.
your things, because in order for you to make that minimum wage and to have it go up,
That's a good
that
point.
local store you're working
Right.
in needs you and your friends shopping there. So we can have a positive spiral up
Right.
versus where we may or may not disagree, the spiral down that we've
Down,
had
yeah.
with
Right.
trickle-down economics, because wealthy people seem to be doing better from 40 years ago, and working class people are doing worse. So the whole, in my opinion, and many economics' opinion, the myth of trickle-down hasn't really happened. And so I'd say let's put money in the local economy, put it in workers' pockets, but then they're also obligated. Work hard and make yourself more productive for your employer, and spend that money locally
Right.
so it churns itself
Good
back
point.
up.
Why hasn't, now the legislature has heard all of this. Last 2 years, we brought in the heads of the House, Democrats, Republicans, and Progressive, and I've said to them, what have you heard from the people?
Yep.
And it's just education, cost of living, property tax, and it's the exact same things, and we don't seem to be doing it. And why is there reluctance?
Well,
It's not a
taxes are
party
always
thing.
hard if you're struggling,
Right,
right? So
right.
if you're struggling to pay your bills, and the thing you see on the news every day is about your taxes,
Right.
you're gonna say my taxes are high.
Right.
When you actually delve into it, working class people's taxes in Vermont are pretty well average across the country. Our sales tax, we exempt food. You go to
Right.
Mississippi and some of those really red states, they're paying 8, 9, 10% for their food.
Whoa.
It's brutal. Property taxes, 70% of Vermonters pay based as a percentage of their income. There's a myth out there that if you spend more on your schools, theirs doesn't go up. Well, it
Right.
does. Your property
Right.
tax
Your
bill
prop-
goes up, or your income-based
That's
bill
right,
goes
right.
up. So you do pay more. So it's a real struggle for folks. But we've tried to keep taxes on working class people relatively
Right.
level to the average across the country. But if you're not making enough, it still is a big
Doesn't
bite.
matter,
It's a
right,
big
right.
check that you write either quarterly
Right.
or once a year, depending on
Right.
your town. So it's tough because that's the overarching thing, and it's just taxes, taxes, taxes. And so then politicians are afraid, many of them, I tend to be less afraid, to talk about who's paying the taxes.
Right.
And why are your taxes so hard? And in fact, why are your fees so high? Why is it so much to register your car? When you buy your car, you have to pay such a significant amount. All of these fees go up because we
Right.
say, let's not do broad-based taxes. So when you have politicians, whether it's Peter Shumlin or Jim Douglas or Phil Scott saying, we're not going to raise broad-based taxes, we're actually, if you're a working class person, you're shooting yourself in the foot
Right.
because we raise fees.
Right.
And
I
those
argued
hit
one
working
year,
people more.
they raised all the fees at DMV.
Right.
And I said, that's a tax because everybody
Everybody.
goes to DMV. So
Yeah.
That's right.
you're raising their taxes.
It's a revenue for the state, whether you call it a
right.
tax or a fee. It comes out of the pocket. And so I happen to be an advocate of being a little more clear about who's paying how much. Since, I said this on public radio the other day, and you'll love this one, I'm sure. They asked me about the carbon 2-cent fuel tax.
Oh,
I
yeah.
was going to raise about $4 million to weatherize about 500 more homes a year. Our goal is to have weatherized 60,000 homes in the next couple of years. We've weatherized 25,000. So adding 400 a year is not
Not
gonna quite
yeah, not going to get us there.
balance. And so they asked me, did I support that or not? I said to Bob, before I answer that, let me tell you what I would support. And I said, under the Trump tax cuts, the wealthiest Vermonters have received about a $280 to $300 million tax cut, the top 10% of Vermonters, every year.
Didn't see that in our tax return.
Well, maybe you're in the top 10%.
No, I'm not even
so
in the.
that's part of it. So top 10%, so that's folks whose household income is $150,000 or more.
Oh, that's not us.
Right. They have received on average about a $300 million tax cut, some more, some less within that. I said, if for the next 5 years we took half of that, so take the other half, invest it, well, you got all this money back, take about half of that for 5 years and invest it in Vermont. Say, are you willing as wealthier Vermonters to invest in the future of Vermont? Not ongoing expenses for state government, but what if we put $30 million a year into weatherization, not $4 million?
Right.
You would generate a lot of jobs. That money would churn in the economy.
Right.
Those are local carpenters, insulators, et cetera.
Yeah.
What if you put $30 million into rural broadband for 5 years in a row to leverage private investment and really build the rural economic situation? What if you put $30 million a year for 5 years into subsidizing solar panels or renewable energy vehicles, et cetera? Not for the wealthier folks to get tax credits, but for working class people to put those on their homes, reduce their bills so they put more money into the economy. What if we put $30 million a year into paying down some of that teacher retirement debt,
Right.
or state retirement debt? That's $150 million. That would make it so the annual payments for those next 30 years that have suddenly started to really gobble up the budget could be a little smaller, which would allow more money for some of those services or early childhood investments, et cetera. So what if we did a 5-year capital investment in the state of Vermont's economic future? And we'll see where that goes. Maybe it's a smaller number. Maybe it's 100 million, not 150 million. And those are 20 million each instead of 30 million. But let's ask our wealthiest Vermonters, you just got a big break. And maybe you don't pay that tax if you can show you're already using that break to invest in any of those things.
That's a good idea.
Right? So I had someone call in on the radio and say, I'm putting solar panels on. I'm getting that extra money back. And I said, okay, you're at 150,000. Your tax break was about 3,000.
Right.
So we're only talking about 1,500 in the first place. But if you're putting that kind of money into the local economy and you can show it, then maybe you'd be exempt, right? Because you're doing what we would ask the state to be doing, but it's more efficient if you're already doing it. So there's ways to nuance it and work it to make it, so if you're already going to make those choices and you're going to not just put the money in Wall Street, but you're going to invest in Vermont already, great. Then maybe you'd be exempt. So I do think we need to make investments in these things because, like we said, the chicken's coming home to roost. These bills are there.
It's all going to hit at once because we've already had Moody's. It just went down to A minus, but it went down. And one of the reasons that they stated we didn't talk about was the pension.
Right.
Well, and then you saw the treasurer even this year. There was some talk in the Senate about doing another housing bond, and the treasurer didn't go along with it because it's like we can't do any more. We're already at the breaking point. At least in her opinion, we're already at the breaking point, and we can't push it anymore.
Not until we pay down some of these other debts. And so, to me, if we build the base for the economy with rural broadband and investing in some of these jobs and get folks trained into those jobs, and we pay down some of that debt, then we start to put ourselves on better footing.
Absolutely.
So I think we should talk a little bit about this session.
I told you we were going to get to all these things.
Yeah.
These are deep topics. Okay. So
we're going to have it back again.
Sure.
Phase 2.
Phase
2. But there was a lot of stuff happened or didn't happen at the end of the session.
Happened and didn't happen.
Which we were talking about. The House went home. The Senate thought the House was going to come back and didn't. And so certain key bills were out there, just left.
Yeah.
And
it was
I'm
terribly
assuming
disappointing.
They're going to come back January 6th and they'll be right smack on the calendar again.
It's true. I mean, just like last biennium when cannabis was discussed in the first week, and everybody said, I can't believe you're bringing it up and rushing it through. It's like, actually, it's been sitting on the calendar for 7 months. It's one of the longest sitting bills on
Oh,
the calendar
wow.
that's ever happened. I do think at the beginning of the year next year,
It's gonna be big
some kind
issues.
of arrangements will be made that House and Senate leadership will come to the same page on
Right.
minimum wage and paid family leave. And, like any family, there are disagreements. And, I felt like the political tea leaves from 2018 said the governor vetoed minimum wage, vetoed paid family leave, threw up last minute things on the budget, and the House Republicans and Senate Republicans sort of stood by him.
Right.
And the election results were not very favorable to that. Now, there's other factors. There's the Trump energy and party
Right,
labels.
right.
But ultimately, even races that a lot of us thought were going to be close in the House because of maybe legislators vote on the gun issue
Yeah.
in some rural areas. Some of these folks that we thought were going to be 10 and 30 vote victories were 6 and 8% victories. And so I thought, if the gun vote wasn't going to take you down and these bigger issues were out there for
Right.
folks, then we would come into this session with a lot of momentum behind us to move some of these bills that he had vetoed. And I think some of the political interpretations of that were different in House leadership and Senate leadership, and they had a hard time sort of coming together on that. Constitutionally, the House couldn't just adjourn and go home. There has to be a
Yeah,
mutual
you explained
agreement.
that to me. Mitzi and a couple other people came back every day and sort of had
Well, Monday and
like,
Wednesday.
had a
yeah.
mock.
Yeah, we call them
session.
token sessions
Yeah.
where you move the calendar along, but you don't have the full
Right.
body to be able to make decisions.
Right, so you don't have a quorum.
You don't have the quorum to make decisions. What's interesting is because the House and Senate hadn't agreed on an adjournment resolution, one body can't just say, boom,
See ya.
we're done, see you
Right.
later. They have to come back and have those sessions. So I actually was hoping the speaker would see that she had to come back for 2 sessions. She could have called the body in, and by
Right.
then the calendar would have moved, because part of her argument was that the House Republicans would not suspend the rules. And there's a rule in the procedures that you need 3/4 of a vote
Right.
of the body to not go through the normal delay process of a couple days for a bill to pass. And that's a good safeguard. You want to make sure the minority has the ability to say, you know what, this is going too fast.
Right.
We need
Slow
time to look
down.
at a bill. Well, actually, there were those 2 days, but she decided not to bring them back, which I was frustrated by, because we could have had those bills move along and get
Right.
to the governor. But they'll get to them in January.
And we left marijuana, the bill allows homegrown.
Well, right now,
but not
by
selling, right?
law,
Right,
you can
can't
grow
sell.
your own as of last July.
Right.
And the whole, a larger system of a tax and regulate and a managed
That's
system
still out there.
is still out there, and therefore, the underground system still exists. Young people can go get it on the streets from some drug dealer. There's not the money for prevention. There's not the money for highway safety that there would be under a tax and
Right.
regulate system.
Right.
And ultimately, I was just in Brattleboro for the parade, and folks down there said, you go down to Great Barrington, Mass, or the facility down there, there is a 1 hour wait, not 24/7, they're not open all the time. A lot of Vermont plates.
Oh, really? To buy
cannabis
No
over the
kidding.
border, and we're just sending our money out of state right now, which
Wow.
to me is a foolish errand.
For sure. If you're going to do it, do it.
And where does that bill sit right now? Is it still in the House? The
That
tax
one
and
is in
regulate
the House.
bill?
The speaker said it needs more time and it's got to go through a lot of committees. I mean, we've been talking about this for 5
Yeah,
years.
right,
The Senate
right.
has passed this over and over
Yeah.
again.
Yeah.
The speaker is just not very enthusiastic about this topic. I don't know if it's a personal issue or her district, but she, I think, is a little bit out of step with the majority of the state at this point to move forward, and is using some of the arguments of it's got to go through this committee and go through that committee. I've been in this process for a
Yeah,
long
right,
time.
right.
When a bill has to go through a lot of committees, usually it lives in 1 or 2 committees, and the other committees look at it,
Right, and-
give their recommendations, and they get wrapped in the Appropriations or the Ways and Means Committee. So I think those arguments are a little bit, they certainly sound methodical and reasonable, and I appreciate that effort on her part. But if she wanted that bill to move a little faster, she could have told those chairs, take a couple days,
Right,
look at the
do it.
issues that are relevant
Right.
to your committee, and
Right.
make some recommendations, and that didn't happen.
That's too bad.
What other big bills are you kind of keeping an eye on that are coming back in January? Because really, there's not a whole lot that made it through at all right at the end of the session.
Quite a bit did make it through. There was a lot of work done. Funding on the early child care was
Yeah.
done. There was a lot of work done in transportation on renewable energy issues
Right.
with the state moving towards renewable energy vehicles for a big portion of its fleet, at least those that's practical for. There was work done on women's reproductive freedom and autonomy, allowing women to have autonomy over their own bodies, which I know is controversial for some, but I think in Vermont it's pretty strongly supported. The Senate passed the constitutional amendment 28-2. That's pretty telling. The House Bill 57, which I think is on the governor's desk for a decision today or tomorrow, is a big deal. Big issues for the economy. I think minimum wage was a big loss not to see that move through. I think a lot of Vermonters are
my issue was a minimum wage. If you've got 10 employees, guy on the bottom of the rung is making 10 because he's been there for a long time. You bring somebody new in and he makes 10. You've got to move people up the ladder.
Sure, there's the compression up above.
You've got to give them,
right.
and
that's
I'm
my
not sure.
business. I have 10 employees.
Yeah.
Our lowest paid employee now is $13.25. We have H-2A employees, and that's a federal program to allow seasonal workers.
Right.
And if you have anybody doing the same work as them, they have to get paid the same. So I had already over the last 2 years been bumping up my crew to get to that. And $13.25 today is about $15 in 2024 when you include inflation. So I'm working my way towards that, pretty close to it. My top employees are $15.50 or so, and so they will go up some. They won't go up as fast, but I can keep the hierarchy.
You
can keep the hierarchy, and everybody does benefit. And as they stay more years, one of the benefits of these H-2A employees, they come back. And this year, they already know my systems much better than last year.
Yeah.
And when you have turnover with the very bottom rung paid employees, you also are spending a huge amount of time and effort training them.
Right.
Yeah.
So your cost
so now you
is
can
there,
hopefully keep them.
and we'll have more returning employees. So yes, there's wage compression, but in the long run, your business is better off with people staying longer, learning your systems, and being more efficient.
The challenge, right, is if you're a business competing with another business who's not playing by the same rules, right? Then that's challenging.
And I compete with others because, first of all, as an elected official, but also it's the right thing to do. All my employees are paid above board. You've got some people being paid under the table. So that's a whole nother area where it's not level.
Right.
But then if you don't have the minimum wage going up a bit, which levels everybody, if it goes up, everybody's got to pay it. That levels the playing field between the employers that are doing the right thing and trying to help their employees make a living in their work and those that are more struggling.
So what's your take on the cross-border dynamics? We have a border with New York that will be close to parity after a 2024 increase. We have a border with New Hampshire, which may or may not be, just depending on what happens, but it looks like probably not. Who knows?
It's an issue, but I've seen a lot of those eastern border legislators moving more and more towards minimum wage. 10 years ago, I remember it was like Democrat, Republican, no way, no way, no way. But what we've seen is that people actually, when they make more money, yes, some are going to go across the line, but a lot in the day-to-day are going to spend it in their community as well. I mean, when you're driving to work, you don't always have the extra 25 minutes to drive across the border and back to get your cup of coffee or your whatnots. And again, as I spoke of earlier, part of it is also talking about these issues in a little deeper way and say, if you stay here with your money, that means that person's going to have a little more money to put a deck on their house, which means they're going to hire the carpenter that's going to do this, or the electrician for the lighting. So if Vermonters had a little more money in their pocket and weren't quite so desperate to always have to find the absolute cheapest thing to buy, then they could start to be a little more local focused in their purchasing. But we've been spiraling down for 30, 40 years. It's time to try something different.
Yeah.
So are you getting any reaction in the State House for your ideas and your approach?
Over time, I think, there's times I put things in my newsletter. Folks can go to ltgov.vermont.gov and sign up for a newsletter that we put out on different issues. There was an end of session issue we just put out that talked about my frustration with those issues, but also what did the State House do for parent-child centers, reach-up support, lead testing in schools to help families.
That was a big bill that did make it through at the end.
Absolutely. And through that newsletter, I gained support out there for some of these issues. And I've had legislators come up to me and say, oh, I just heard from some constituents. They got their newsletter and they called me about that issue. So what are you doing? I said, I'm just empowering them to be a part of democracy. And it's both a grumble and a respect that they come to tell me because people are getting involved.
Yeah. So what do you do during the summer to keep this momentum going? Do you work with your fellow politicians?
Mostly I work out in the field, whether it's the farm field or the people field out across the state, and just continue to try to empower them to push their legislators more. I also remind folks, just because you think your legislator is good on an issue, don't make any assumption.
Right.
Go ahead and call them and ask them where are they on something, because sometimes they're going to surprise you that they didn't push as far as you thought they would, or they
Right.
voted against an amendment that was offered to do what you thought they'd support,
Right.
but then they didn't because leadership said we can't go any farther or
Right.
whatnot.
Right.
And so I think it's important to call your legislator, whether you agree with them or disagree with them, have a respectful conversation and ask them where they stand on some issues. Don't always tell people. Nobody likes to be told what to do. No one likes a finger pointing in their face going, you
They
better
like to
do
be
this.
asked, that's for sure.
So have that conversation
Yeah.
with your legislator. They're accessible. Talk to them about the things you care about, and that will push them a little farther.
I think that's a really good point. And I think there's two issues, we've talked about both of them, that come to mind where that dynamic's at play. And I think minimum wage and the marijuana bills in particular, where a legislator can say, oh yes, I support that. I support minimum wage, or I support marijuana. And then you're like, okay, so, and then a
But they
bill
don't
actually,
make it come to a vote.
right, the
Right.
a bill lands on their desk and they're like, oh, I don't like that one, send me
For
a
this
different one.
version.
For this
Yeah.
version of it. And it's like, okay, well, what would you support? And then it becomes kind of a nuanced thing of like, okay, yes, okay, I support it in this exact instance, but not in,
And if more constituents call and say, I hope you'll support it, in the end, they don't know all the nuances. Many of them do. But if you then have voted no, they will have had that conversation with you and made the points why it's important, and it makes it a little harder to
Yeah.
vote no.
Right.
Or yes, whatever the
Or you have to,
direction
then you have
want
to
to be.
explain your vote. Like, why did you vote no?
And that's our job
Right.
as elected people, is to
But we have
speak
1
about it.
minute left.
All
You
right.
have to, you have to wrap it up for us about
What do you want?
what do I want?
Yeah.
View of the legislature this year and looking forward to next year.
I am looking forward to next year. I think a lot of legislators are disappointed with how it ended. There's still a lot of finger pointing, but I think when people breathe a bit, go home, they'll see that finger pointing doesn't lead to productivity, and that folks need to take responsibility on all sides for what worked and what didn't. Folks need to talk to their constituents about these issues, and if they really, their constituents want them to happen, those constituents need to let them know, and they'll come back in January ready to get it
Yeah.
done.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think there were any winners in the way that the
No, it just
legislative
makes the
session
whole
wrapped up.
system look bad, and actually, we have it a lot better than a lot of states with that accessibility,
Yeah.
and I hope folks
Well,
will
we
take
had
advantage of it.
Guy Page come in and talk about the bills that we didn't read about, because there were the main ones we talked about tonight. There were actually a lot of bills that were
A lot of
passed,
them,
gets
uh,
yeah.
done.
And
Yeah.
they passed, earlier in a lot of them passed earlier in the session. There's a bunch that came in right after crossover.
Yeah, so I thought that was pretty neat, that there was a list a mile long of bills.
A
that
lot
were
more than
passed.
happens than's
Yeah,
in the
I think
media.
so. I think
Yeah,
so.
exactly.
Well, we're a pleasure to have you on the show.
Well, thank
We're going
you.
to have you back.
I'm happy to
because
come back.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
for
We
the
get
chat.
through half the questions. You're.
Well, you had a big list.
Well,
yeah,
I know, but
big
you know,
list.
we had a guest one time that was just doing yes and no, and I got through the questions about quarter after. I thought, now what? So I have a lot of questions. But anyway, thank you very much for your
Glad
time.
to be here.
That's one thing you do, Lieutenant Governor, is you spent time with me talking marijuana one time.
Yeah. Or
And-
cannabis, as
or
it were.
cannabis, as it were. Yes. Thank you very much. In the meantime, folks, we'll see you next week, and in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.